I hope that this will be my final entry in this journal, which I started once as a way to record my expulsion from home. For 7 years I have wallowed in my bitterness and grief, determined to come back and do something to bring forth justice, and yet been too afraid to do much in actuality, besides scavenging old ruins. I have been alone, so alone that my own mind became my only friend, while memories of those I knew and loved faded until their reality became impossible to recall. I had nearly forgotten what my own face looked like, and even now I find it hard to recognize it when I do see it. So much I have changed. But I have hope, some hope at least now, that I can change once more. Perhaps not to how I was, but a new version of who is like the boy who grew up here in Illyria. I am still not certain how the palace guards found me, though it is likely that I was simply too careless, and assumed that my years away would have erased much of how I was remembered. After they took me, I was taken on a ship to the town's borders, from where we dispatched on foot towards the palace. The guards had swapped out my own helmet for a clear one, so that nothing could obstruct my face from the curious glances of those walking around town. I did my best to keep my dignity, walking with my posture straight and looking only straight ahead. At least I was taller than both the guards who were walking me, although this did not mean much when one had a dagger pointed at my back the entire time. I had no interest in running, however, as I was aware of how useless that would be. Not only would I never be able to get back to our ship, I also didn't know where Seb was, and departing without him, or at least bidding him goodbye, would be utterly foolish. What I wasn't prepared for were the sudden yelps of the crowd that had gathered in the park at the center of town. In 7 years' time, the park had withered to a much smaller version of what it had been in my childhood. At that, I did move my eyes towards it, and this changed everything at once. The crowd wasn't that big, really more like a few groups of people looking at two very poor fighters attempting to duel. One was a middle-aged man, his suit very clean and sword very fancy. The other was in a black palace suit, with a decent sword, their brown hair in a familiar color. Only when they turned round did I immediately start running towards them, ignoring the sharp pain of the dagger slicing open the back of my suit and piercing skin. I let my instincts take over as I pushed back the older man and stood protective over the younger one. Seb's eyes were wide in shock when I appeared, and he looked as though he'd gotten a shave. Why he would waste money on such vandies I didn't understand at that moment, though I wasn't going to admonish him. The entire scene at the park had become a blur in my mind, though I can remember the pain of Seb's ignorance worse than the physical wound at my back, and worsened only by his familiarity with the lady at the scene, one dressed in wealthy fashions and with an ice-like beauty. As I was dragged away and towards the palace, I admonished myself, foolish for having believed him to be someone different, someone who could have actually cared. Thus I was sullen and quiet when I was thrown into a cell, and refused to speak when a guard interrogated me. I was given scraps of food to feed on, and 1 glass of water, but refused both. For a few hours of the early evening, I fell into a small fits of sleep, during which I had nightmares of all that I experienced, my childhood, the escape out of Illyria, and now my return. In that last one, the guard behind me revealed himself to be Seb, and all of his time with me to be a ploy to get me back here to fake the Jew's justice. I was then justifiably, I think, even more sulky upon waking up and finding the Duke sitting in my cell in his perfect uniform, light brown hair pushed in perfect waves, and hazel eyes, bright despite the dimness of the cell. As I observed him, I realized that he was much too young to be the Duke that I remembered from the time before my exile. This one looked much like his father had, or what I imagine his father must have looked like while young. It was unnerving to realize that the person who held my life in his hands was likely my age, or even younger. He introduced himself, which was of course rather useless. Then he tried to ask me questions, the same ones the guard had asked before, only phrased differently. I remained equally quiet, observing this duke. After at least 5 or 6 unanswered questions, he also remained silent for a while, glaring at me. I doubt that he finds many who refuse his will, even those he imprisons. Then he asked me why I had done what I had at the park, and I could not hide the twitch in my face. I had been doing my best to try not to think about it too much, the image of Seb in the palace suit, the likelihood of his betrayal. Of course, the Duke noticed the change in me, and he pushed on, demanding my answers. I was saved then by a sudden rumbling from somewhere else in the palace, somewhere below. For some reason, the Dubois family had built their jail cells in one of the biggest floors in the palace and one of the highest, albeit still in a wing far away from where the family and servants lived. Still, we both heard sounds from elsewhere in the palace, and the Duke stood up quickly, leaving the jail cell. I did my best to sharpen my hearing, to try and catch what was happening. It would have been too optimistic to hope for a revolt against the Duke. I did not have to wait long, however, and suddenly a palace guard was thrown into the jail. He flew before my eyes, slammed against the wall, and slumped to the ground, unmoving. Soon followed the Duke, in his hand a gun, as he whirled and slammed the door shut. Despite leaning his entire body weight on it, the door rattled as someone tried to get inside. Or perhaps something, given the inhuman growling that was now very loud indeed. The sky outside was dark, the only light in the room being the light in my cell, and the emergency sign above the door the Duke was struggling to hold closed. I rose up and got as close to the wires of my cell as I could, given that I had been chained. With a pointed look, I asked the Duke what was happening, but he could not respond, straining against the door as he was. While he wasn't a weak man, and I would wager significantly stronger physically than his father had been, he was soon slammed against the wall too, as the door opened and the creature strode inside. It turned to look at me, and my entire body went rigid as I looked into human eyes. Or at least they had once been human, as had the entire being. It stood on 2 legs and had 2 arms at the end of which were human hands. Everything was warped, however, the limbs an extended length, nails long and curling at the ends of the skin completely green, with spots of moss growing in odd places. Only once the creature got closer to the light did I realize that the eye sockets were empty, the darkness of them being the inside of the being's skull. It thrust one arm through the bars of my cell, and I backed away, barely out of its reach. It let out a decidedly inhuman screech as it clawed against the bars, and during those moments I was grateful to be caged as I was. Behind the creature, the Duke had gotten back on his feet, and was seemingly trying to quietly leave the room. His suit had become rumpled, and his nose appeared to be broken, blood pouring down his face. I would not allow him to leave me here to die, so I called out to him loudly. Outside the jail, screams echoed throughout the building, not screams of the creatures, but those of people. It was this that granted me my freedom, as I yelled to the Duke, telling him that by leaving me in the cell he was discarding one useful fighter against these beings. The creature with us had turned around slowly, looking around to who I was talking to. Perhaps it was my appeal about my usefulness in battle, or my realization that the creatures were only blind, which won me my freedom. Or perhaps the Duke's only way of ducking from the creature's sudden attack was to scramble closer to my door. He only held my eyes for a moment before nodding, quickly swiping his wrist, upon which was an odd bracelet, on the door which opened with a snap. I rolled to the other wall in the jail, the one where the dead guard was still laying, and took his weapons. In quick movements, thankfully my time in jail hadn't eroded my strength that much yet, I was able to defeat the creature, cutting off one of its legs, and then its head. It rolled around, empty eyes looking up at me in an eerie manner. Apparently impressed, the Duke nodded at me approvingly, and I shrugged. Together we made our way towards the sounds of battle. What we encountered was at least a dozen more creatures, all similar but not exactly the same. Despite their seemingly human features, they did not speak any human tongue or behave in a humane manner, however, instead attacking violently and without mercy. Thus we were forced to defend ourselves as best we could, and during the fighting, many fell on both sides. During one moment, close to when we'd nearly defeated the horde, I found myself close to the Duke, having just defeated one of the larger beings together with one of the palace guards. The Duke was facing one being all by himself, and was going to lose. Afterwards, I considered my actions. I could have ignored this and let the Duke suffer the fate of being mauled to death by these creatures. But in the moment, I did not even think, simply plunged in to save him. His eyes were wide with shock and terror, as a spray of blood covered his face when I stabbed the sword I'd taken cleanly through the creature's chest and slid it downwards, cleaving it in half. The horde was outnumbered, and in the end, only one survived, though captured in a group effort by several guards. It was dragged into the jail wing, screeching the entire time. In those moments after the battle, no one was yet looking to chain me once more, and so I made my way to Seb quickly. He was inspecting a wound on his arm, though thankfully it did not appear grave. I could not find any other words but, "Do you still pretend not to know me?" And the boy I'd saved turned around and looked at me, eyes big and full of a mixture of emotions. Before he could answer, however, the Duke appeared and with a strict yet concerned voice ordered Seb to go to the infirmary to heal his arm. He nodded, but did tell me that we would talk afterwards. I found these words somewhat ominous, but could not think too much about them, as the Duke stood before me. I asked him whether he would chain me again, but he admitted that given that I'd saved his life, that would be in very poor taste. Instead, he led me away from the mess of the battle into an office. Perhaps his own, for he knew where to find a cache of alcohol. He poured both of us a cup of something rich and strong, which I appreciated greatly. After a moment of silence, he told me he would hear my story, the entirety of it, for he had only the memories of what his father had told him about me and the official criminal records. I understood how generous this gesture was, and did not waste time, speaking for a long time, doing my best to recall every important detail. Over 7 years ago now, I had been living in Illyria, the son of a family who lived in town. My father owned an armory, and was employed by the Duke's father himself to make parts of the suits worn by palace guards and staff. I was set to inherit after my father, and was raised to be proper, to take care of my mother and my sisters, to eventually find a good wife, though this always irked me, and to be a good citizen of Illyria. And until that point, I had done quite well. I was only 20 when everything went wrong. My family had gone on a small vacation to the farmlands outside of Illyria to visit some relatives. Upon their return, my youngest sister began showing signs of illness. Soon it spread to everyone, except for me, for I had stayed behind to look after the shop. We sought out the help of every doctor in town, even those of the palace and Keaton estate. It was surprising, and also an honor, when my family was taken to the palace, to be under the supervision of the Duke's personal doctor. At first, I was allowed to visit frequently, but once my family did not start getting better, my visits lessened and lessened, until finally I wasn't allowed entry at all. It was through neighbors and gossip that I learned of the plague that had begun spreading through the farmlands that my family had visited, and how those infected there, the ones who hadn't died, had also been taken by palace guards. I began ignoring my responsibilities in the armory as I tried to find out more, and through my investigations, I came across the Green Gardeners. With their help, I learned the truth of where my family was, taken to a facility outside of town where they would be under supervision until their death. Apparently, at the palace, it was believed that there was no cure for this illness. I paused for a moment to see what effect these words would have upon the Duke. He wasn't looking at me, however, simply staring forwards. Thus I continued to the end of my tragic tale. For years the Green Gardeners had been trying to destroy these facilities, for they believed that a cure would be found. These people would be saved. It was with their help that I attempted to free my family. It all went wrong, however, and we were caught. While I managed to escape, nobody else did. I hijacked the ship from the palace guards and flew it out of the moon itself. For the past 7 years, I have been living on a satellite, biding my time until I could return here. And having returned, I immediately failed, and have gotten myself arrested by a different Duke's guards. A silence followed after my story, and the Duke admitted that the facts of my tale had been significantly altered, and that he would take my confession into account. I wondered at this, at how different he was compared to his father. He then sighed and admitted that the arrival of Kieran had changed everything. I was confused as to who this Kieran was, but when the Duke offered to let me have one of the guest rooms with a private bath, I did not question his kindness. I made my way there, cleaned myself, and fell into the most comfortable bed I had ever been in, where I slept dreamlessly for hours. I was awakened by a servant, who informed me that the Duke was awaiting me in his dining hall. After dressing in some clothes I took from the wardrobe, my own had disappeared during the night, I assumed to be washed, I was led to this hall by the same servant. She kept eyeing me as I walked behind her, perhaps worried that as a criminal I would attack her the first moment I could. I ignored her. When we arrived, I saw the Duke, seemingly unmarked by the battle, as well as Seb, whose arm was wrapped with a band-aid. The two were standing side by side, deep in conversation. After my arrival was noted by them, the Duke called everyone to attention. With a grave voice, he announced that Countess Lillian of Keaton Estate had sent news. Apparently, a wedding was to occur at this estate that same day, and all of us in that room would go to attend and find out what was happening, for no one knew that the Countess had chosen a groom. As everyone left for a carriage towards the estate, I asked the Duke why I was to go as well, and he shrugged. Half jokingly, he stated that should a fight break out, he would want the best fighter in Illyria on his side, and I accepted the compliment with a confused smile. The Duke and Seb rode in a different carriage from mine to Keaton Estate, and when we arrived, everyone was rushing to enter. A serving girl greeted the Duke at the door, and then with a surprised, and I would also say suspicious look, she greeted Seb. However, she did not call him by his name, instead referring to him as Kieran. Some gears began turning in my mind, recalling the Duke's earlier words about this Kieran as well. My mind concocted the most likely theory, that being that Seb must have been lying to me about his name, and that his true one must have been Kieran all along. I filed this under the other betrayals and hurts I'd felt due to him, and followed stiffly with everyone else as we were led into a large garden inside the estate. It had been decorated elaborately, clearly signifying the wealth of this countess. Tiny lanterns were strewn about, sheer shimmering sheets had been draped on trees, and flower chains decorated 3 rows of seats. This felt like too many seats, as it didn't appear like there were that many guests. Simply those of us who had arrived from the palace, and those who already stood around waiting. There were 2 noblemen who I could tell were also wealthy, and likely well-born given their suits and arrogant expressions, and members of the estate staff, though dressed in their finest as well. The bride was nowhere to be seen yet. After getting over the initial awe of the place, I turned around to look for Seb, or Kieran, and saw that he was looking at the entrance of the garden, and so was everyone else. It was undoubtedly the Countess who appeared, in a gorgeous dress with long sleeves and gloves, with a helmet that appeared more like a bubble than one could pop with the touch of his hand. Beaming, she approached Seb and took his hand, which caused everyone to get up. What followed were several minutes of utter confusion, much of which has even in my mind become messy. I got closer to the bride, only to hear her say the words, "my groom," to Seb, Kieran, whatever, much to the shock of everyone, except for the serving girl who was grimacing in the background. Seb stepped back, snatching his arm from the Countess's as the Duke turned towards him, appearing as though he'd been slapped. If I wasn't myself mortified, I would have found him utterly hilarious. How could Seb have been engaged to this entire time and not told me? Only further confusion emerged, however, when Seb loudly proclaimed that he hadn't come here to marry anyone. Now it was the Countess's turn to appear aggrieved. While the Duke's eyes were so wide open, it would have been a reasonable fear for them to pop out of their sockets. For a while, all was chaos, as Lillian raged against Seb, insisting that only the previous evening he had accepted her hand. The Duke meanwhile was fuming, accusing Seb of having been courting the Countess for himself, despite having been sent to her in his place. Seb meanwhile was looking at both of them, trying to talk to each one, but finding it impossible to do so. It was only the serving girl who heard the ringing at the door as she disappeared, before returning with another guest in hand. It might be my bias, but I do believe I was the first one to see him, and I gasped in shock. Seb, the second one. Unlike the one from the palace, he was in his normal uniform, the white one we'd repaired together. Breaking out of their argument, everyone turned around as more people wondered at the appearance of an identical person to the one already in the garden. The first one to move was Seb, or Kieran, or whoever, as he ran into the arms of his doppelganger. It was the Countess who got out of her stupor first, demanding to get some answers. And then Seb, my Seb, began to apologize for leading her on and allowing her to believe that he would marry her. Together, he and Kieran explained their story, well, put it together so that all would make sense. For Kieran wasn't a man at all. He was Seb's sister Vivi, who we had flown here to find. Apparently, she had been hiding in Illyria, disguised as a man for weeks, at first simply trying to survive, but now finding herself tangled in the knot of the people here and the rot that is threatening their lives. When I had gotten caught and was taken to the palace, it was not Seb that I saw attacked by some foolish men, but Vivi, which explained her utter lack of recognition of me. And upon our arrival, Seb, who had gone to see the Countess at the encouragement of some locals, had found himself to be confused for this disguise that Vivi had been dressed as, this Kieran. Then he explained, doing his best to be kind about it, that he played along with Lillian's beliefs in order to learn more about Kieran, who he had suspected to be Vivi, due to how similar he and his sister looked. And indeed, it was jarring how closely the two resembled one another. Only when they were next to each other did the differences show themselves in their height, slightly different facial aspects, and expressions. Upon learning about all these betrayals, Lillian got enraged and turned her burning gaze on both the Messas siblings. In a voice choked by tears, she stated that she would never see either one again, and that everyone was to leave the estate immediately, that no one would be given entry to the Lovenot greenhouse, ever. For a moment silence reigned, and while I don't understand why the greenhouse was so important, I would come to do so soon. Shaking herself out of the shock, Vivi followed after Lillian, stating mainly to the Duke that she would go and convince her to let them enter the greenhouse. The Duke appeared pained by her departure, but did not refuse, instead settling down on a bench, deep in thought. I made my way to Seb, who had been staring at me for some time. Together we moved to a more separate area of the garden, where the curious gazes of everyone else could not follow. With shameful eyes, he apologized to me for all that had happened, blaming himself for my arrest. I of course forgave him, telling him I was simply glad to know that he hadn't been a backstabbing spy all along. After all of this, things still followed, as the fate of Illyria was not resolved yet, but I shall leave the final chapter of the Moon story to be told by someone else. For my own tale, that of a lonely exile's return to his home, had ended. I have found a new purpose for a new life and someone to spend it with. And so I shall conclude this journal and put it away so that it may gather dust and perhaps be forgotten in time.